Hi, you're on Reddit Confessions, and I need you to tell me if I've finally lost my mind, or if what happened last night would have made anyone feel sick. The thing about office parties is, they're not supposed to feel like the opening scene of some slow-motion disaster. But that's exactly what it was. I was standing near the buffet table, pretending to care about a platter of shrimp, when I saw my wife, Clarissa, weaving through the crowd. She wasn't looking at me, she was locked in step with this guy I'd never seen before. They moved like they'd been walking side by side for years, not like two coworkers heading toward a husband who'd just shown up. Before they reached me, he stopped her mid-step to say something, low, right against her ear. She laughed. Not just laughed, it was that short, breathy laugh she usually saved for private moments. My stomach actually dropped, like my body knew what my brain didn't want to admit. When they finally got to where I was standing, I expected her to turn toward me. Instead, she turned slightly toward him, like I was just another face in the crowd. He looked at me the way someone might look at a photo they're trying to remember, tilting his head, squinting just a little, like I didn't quite match the version he'd been told about. No hello, no handshake, just this tiny smirk before he leaned toward the food table, as if I wasn't even worth his full attention. Clarissa finally said, "Oh, Leonard's here," in this half-surprised tone, as if I'd crashed her night instead of coming to the event she'd been talking about for weeks. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. But then, in the middle of the noise and music, I caught him saying something to her that made her glance at me, quickly, almost guiltily, and then turn away just as fast. It wasn't jealousy I felt. It was something worse. It was the creeping realization that maybe I was the only one in that room who thought I was there to be part of her evening. And that was before I saw what happened on the balcony. From where I stood, I had a clear view of the balcony through the glass doors. At first, I thought Clarissa had stepped out for some air, she tends to get warm in crowded rooms. But then I noticed she wasn't alone. Bryce was out there with her, both of them leaning against the railing, the city light stretching out behind them like a perfect postcard. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could read their body language like subtitles in a movie I didn't want to watch. He was angled toward her, one hand resting casually on the rail near her arm, closing the space between them in a way that felt practiced. She was laughing again, that same short laugh I'd heard earlier, only this time she reached out and touched his sleeve as if she needed to steady herself. I told myself to stop staring, but my eyes wouldn't listen. It wasn't just the way they stood, it was the pauses. Moments where neither of them was talking, yet neither seemed uncomfortable in the silence. I've been married long enough to know that kind of ease doesn't come from a few harmless work conversations. There's history in that kind of quiet. My chest felt tight, but instead of marching out there and demanding answers, like some bold movie husband, I just stood frozen in place, my hand clenched around a half-empty glass of punch. At one point, Bryce glanced toward the door and spotted me. He didn't look startled. If anything, he looked satisfied, like I was exactly where he wanted me to be. He said something to Clarissa, and she turned just enough to see me through the glass. Her smile faltered for the briefest second before she gave a small wave, casual, as if nothing was strange about this at all. They stayed out there for another 2 minutes, maybe 3, before she finally came back inside. When she rejoined me, I asked if she'd enjoyed the fresh air, trying to keep my voice neutral. She shrugged and said, "Oh, Bryce just needed to talk through some work stuff." I nodded, but inside I was screaming. Work stuff? At 10 o'clock at night? At a party where no one else seemed remotely interested in discussing anything beyond dessert and the open bar? I wanted to push, to ask why they both looked so comfortable together, but every time I thought of the words, my throat seemed to close. Instead, I followed her as she drifted back into the crowd, always keeping an eye on Bryce. I watched the way he positioned himself so he could see her even when they weren't talking. I noticed the subtle way she gravitated toward his side of the room, even when she didn't seem to realize it. And then, just as the DJ announced the last song of the night, I saw him slip something into her hand before walking toward the exit. She looked down at it quickly, then tucked it into her clutch without a word. By the time we got home, she was humming softly, as if the night had been nothing but perfect. I didn't ask about the balcony, or the thing he'd given her. I just lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every glance, every laugh, every unspoken word between them. And somewhere between midnight and sunrise, I realized I might not want the answers I was starting to look for. The next morning, I tried to act normal, though my mind was still stuck on the image of Bryce leaning in close to Clarissa on that balcony. She moved around the kitchen like nothing had happened, making coffee, scrolling through her phone, humming under her breath. I kept glancing at her clutch bag from last night, still sitting on the counter where she dropped it after we came home. It was ridiculous, I told myself, going through her things would be crossing a line. But every time I looked at it, I saw Bryce's hand slipping something into it, and the urge to know what it was started to gnaw at me until it was all I could think about. When she went upstairs to get ready for work, I gave in. My hands felt clammy as I unfastened the little clasp. Inside was the usual clutter, lipstick, keys, gum, a crumpled receipt. And then, tucked in the side pocket, I found it. A folded piece of heavy cardstock, the kind you'd expect for an invitation or something meant to be kept. No name, no logo, just a short handwritten note in neat, deliberate handwriting, tonight. Same place. Don't be late. My stomach twisted so hard I had to put the note down for a moment. Tonight? Same place. What same place? I quickly put everything back the way I found it, my fingers trembling. When Clarissa came back downstairs, she barely looked at me, just grabbed her bag and said she'd be late because of a strategy session. I nodded like an idiot, my brain screaming behind my calm face. After she left, I paced the living room for what felt like hours, weighing my options. I could confront her right away, but what if I was wrong? What if it was work-related, even though every instinct I had told me it wasn't? By the afternoon, my curiosity had transformed into something sharper, something closer to dread. I called her office, pretending I needed to confirm a time for picking her up later, but the receptionist casually mentioned that most of the team had already left early for the day because the boss had given them Friday afternoon off. That was my breaking point. If she wasn't at work, then where was she? I grabbed my jacket and drove downtown without really knowing what I'd do when I found her. That same place could have been anywhere, but when I pictured it in my mind, all I saw was that balcony. That rooftop venue had an attached lounge that stayed open late. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I thought about walking in there and seeing them together. I told myself maybe it was innocent, maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe I was being ridiculous. But my gut had already decided, whatever I found tonight was going to change everything. By the time the sun started to set, I was parked 2 blocks away from the building, watching the entrance like some sad character in a cheap detective novel. My heart nearly stopped when I saw her appear on the sidewalk, wearing the same navy dress from the party. She wasn't alone. Bryce was right beside her, talking casually, his hand hovering just close enough to hers to make it look almost like they were together. They disappeared inside without a second glance at their surroundings. I sat there, staring at the doorway they just walked through, knowing I was about to follow them in, and that whatever I saw next, I couldn't unsee. I sat in my car longer than I should have, debating with myself like a coward. My heart was pounding so loud it almost drowned out the noise from the street. Every excuse ran through my mind, maybe it was just a work thing, maybe they were meeting clients, maybe the note in her bag was about something innocent. But deep down I knew those were lies I was telling myself because I was afraid of what I'd see if I followed them inside. Eventually, fear of not knowing became worse than fear of finding out. I stepped out of the car, my knees already unsteady, and walked toward the entrance of the lounge. Inside, the lighting was dim, the kind of low amber glow that makes everyone look like they're in a movie scene. Music thumped softly in the background, and a few scattered tables were occupied by people talking in low voices. My eyes scanned the room, searching for them, and there they were, tucked away in a corner booth near the back. Bryce sat with his arm resting casually along the back of the seat, angled toward Clarissa. She was leaning in slightly, her face lit by a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. My stomach churned when I realized how comfortable they looked, as if this wasn't the first time they'd been there together. I slid into an empty table near the bar, half hidden behind a tall plant, close enough to see but far enough to hope they wouldn't notice me. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught fragments, her laughing softly, him saying something about keeping it between us, her hand briefly brushing against his as if it was second nature. My mind was doing somersaults trying to fit this into a version of reality that didn't end with my marriage being a lie. But the longer I watched, the less room there was for denial. Then something happened that made my hands go cold. Bryce reached into his jacket pocket and slid something small across the table to her, a key. She looked at it for a moment, then nodded and slipped it into her clutch without hesitation. They didn't even speak about it. It was like a silent agreement, one they'd already discussed before tonight. My pulse started racing in a different way, and my throat felt dry. What was the key for? An apartment? A hotel room? Somewhere they'd been meeting without me knowing. I stayed frozen, trying to convince myself to get up and confront them, but I couldn't. Every scenario I imagined ended with me looking pathetic, or worse, her telling me I was overreacting and making me feel like I was the problem. After a while, they stood up together. She touched his arm as they headed toward the exit, and I felt a sharp jolt in my chest that made me sink deeper into my seat so they wouldn't spot me. I waited until they were gone before I left, moving slowly like I was carrying the weight of a truth I didn't want to face. Driving home, I couldn't stop picturing that key in her clutch. It was more than just a piece of metal, it was proof of something I wasn't ready to name out loud. And as I sat alone in the dark living room later that night, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside, I knew that whatever I did next would decide whether I uncovered the full story, or spent the rest of my life pretending I didn't see it coming. Sleep didn't happen that night. I just sat there in the living room, staring at nothing, replaying every moment from the lounge until it all blurred together. My mind kept circling back to that key. I tried to tell myself it could have been anything, maybe it was for a storage locker or a filing cabinet at work, but every time I pictured the way she slipped it into her clutch without hesitation, my stomach twisted tighter. She didn't ask him what it was for because she already knew. That detail kept eating at me. By the time the first light crept through the blinds, I'd made up my mind, I had to find out. Clarissa left for work just after 8, her tone light and casual, as if we hadn't spent the previous evening in separate worlds. She kissed my cheek on the way out, the same quick kiss you'd give a neighbor watering your plants, and it made my skin crawl. As soon as I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I grabbed her clutch from the dresser. My hands were shaking as I dug through it, and there it was, the key, still warm from sitting in her bag. Holding it, I felt like I was holding a fuse, and every second I delayed was another step toward an explosion. There was no tag or marking, but the shape wasn't for a house. It was longer, heavier, more like a key for an apartment or a private office. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I put the key in my pocket, grabbed my jacket, and told myself I'd just see where it fit. Just confirm it was nothing. That's all. I started by driving toward the part of town where her office was, circling the blocks, scanning for any place that looked like it belonged to him. Half an hour passed before I spotted something, a narrow brick building with blacked-out windows on the second floor and a small brass keypad by the door. A private loft, maybe. I parked 2 blocks away, my palms slick, and walked there like I was just another pedestrian. Standing in front of the door, I hesitated. If the key fit, then all my worst fears would start solidifying into reality. But if it didn't, I'd still be left with questions I couldn't answer. My hand was trembling when I slid the key in. It turned. Smooth. Effortless. My breath caught in my throat and I just stood there for a second, listening to the sound of my pulse in my head. When I finally pushed the door open, I stepped into a dim hallway that smelled faintly of cologne and something else, faint perfume that wasn't hers, at least not the one she wore for me. The air felt still, too still, like the space had been carefully arranged and then abandoned just long enough to feel suspicious. I took a few cautious steps inside, my eyes adjusting to the light. There was a small table against the wall, and on it sat a half-empty wine bottle, 2 glasses, and a scarf I recognized immediately. It was hers, the one she'd worn last winter, the one I'd given her for our anniversary. My chest tightened so much I could barely breathe. This wasn't a place for work strategy sessions. This was something else entirely, and the scarf was just the first crack in a dam I'd been desperately holding together. I wanted to run out right then, but another part of me, a part one barely recognized, needed to see more. I needed to know exactly how deep this went before I decided what to do next. I stood frozen in that hallway longer than I care to admit, my hand still resting on the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping me upright. The scarf was bad enough, but the wine glasses, those were harder to explain away. One glass had lipstick marks along the rim, and not the shade Clarissa wore last night. My head was spinning. Either she had been here with Bryce before and brought someone else along, or she'd been here with Bryce on more than one occasion, enough times to leave traces of herself behind without caring who might see them. Both options felt like a punch to the gut. I stepped farther inside, my shoes sinking into a thick rug that muffled the sound of my movement. The space opened into a small loft-style living area, minimal furniture, but everything in it looked expensive and carefully chosen, too carefully for someone who just needed a place to crash after work. A leather couch sat angled toward a low table, where a single magazine lay open to an article about romantic getaways in the countryside. My stomach tightened again. This wasn't a workspace, and it definitely wasn't neutral ground. This was a place meant for privacy. On the counter in the corner kitchen, there was an empty takeout container from a high-end Italian place we used to visit for anniversaries. The receipt was still inside, dated 2 nights ago. I picked it up without thinking, and my hand started shaking when I saw the note scribbled on the back, same time next week. No names, no signatures, but my mind didn't need them. My wife didn't just run into Bryce outside of the office, this was a planned, recurring thing. I turned toward a partially open door near the back, the one part of the loft I hadn't seen yet. Every bone in my body told me to leave, to walk out before I found something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But my curiosity was stronger than my self-preservation. I pushed it open slowly and found myself in a bedroom. The bed was neatly made, but there was an indentation on one side of the mattress, like someone had been sitting there recently. A faint trace of her perfume hung in the air, and beside the bed on the nightstand was something that stopped me cold, a framed photo of Bryce and Clarissa at what looked like a company event, both of them smiling, standing just close enough that it could be passed off as innocent, but knowing what I knew now, it wasn't. I backed out of the room, my pulse thudding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I didn't know if she was still in the city with him, if she was planning to come back here later, or if I'd just walked into the scene of their last meeting. The only thing I knew for sure was that the moment I left this place, I couldn't unknow any of it. Confronting her without proof might give her room to twist the story, but keeping silent felt like drowning slowly. I locked the door behind me, slipped the key back into my pocket, and walked out into the street feeling like my body was moving on autopilot. The city noise felt muffled, as if I was hearing it from underwater. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing: if she thought I was blind to what she was doing, she was about to learn I'd seen more than she ever wanted me to. By the time I got back home, the daylight felt wrong, too bright for the heaviness pressing down on me. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, just staring at the countertop where her clutch had been the day before, thinking about how easy it would be for her to walk in later, smile, and carry on like nothing in our lives had shifted. But everything had shifted. I knew now that the key was real, the loft was real, and whatever was happening between her and Bryce had been going on long enough to leave breadcrumbs all over that place. I wanted to throw the key in her face and demand answers, but I couldn't shake the fear that she'd talk her way out of it, twist things around until I felt like I was the crazy one. If I was going to confront her, I needed to do it in a way she couldn't wriggle out of. So I started planning. My phone sat in front of me, and for the first time in my life, I actually Googled things like, how to record without being noticed, and discreet GPS tracker. I felt ridiculous, like I was playing a role in some bad soap opera, but I also knew I didn't have the luxury of pride anymore. If I didn't act, she'd keep meeting him in that loft, keep telling me lies about late nights at the office, and I'd keep pretending not to notice until I woke up one day realizing I'd let her dismantle our marriage piece by piece. That evening, she came home earlier than usual, humming like she had the night before, her face lit with the kind of glow you get from being somewhere you actually want to be. She kissed me on the cheek, asked what I'd had for dinner, and launched into a story about a chaotic day at work. I nodded, smiled, played my part. All the while, I couldn't stop thinking about the scarf on that table and the photo in that bedroom. I told her I'd be running errands the next day, just to plant the seed that I wouldn't be around. She barely reacted, which somehow hurt even more. Later, after she'd gone to bed, I took her clutch from the dresser again, carefully slipping the key out and replacing it with a tiny recording device I'd ordered for same-day pickup. It was small enough to be unnoticed, sensitive enough to pick up her conversations if she took it with her. I didn't know if it would catch anything, but even the thought of having a shred of her unfiltered words gave me a grim sort of comfort. The next morning, she left for another meeting, and I watched her car disappear down the street. My hands were sweating as I opened the tracking app I'd installed on her phone 2 nights earlier, another thing I never thought I'd do in my life. The little dot moved steadily across the map, heading in a familiar direction. My throat tightened as I saw it stop within a block of the loft. I sat there staring at the screen, the evidence piling up in real time, and it took everything I had not to get in my car and drive straight there. Instead, I waited. Hours passed before the dot started moving again, back toward our side of town. When she finally walked in the door, she was cheerful, asking if I wanted to watch a movie later. I smiled and agreed, like we were still living in the same reality. Inside, though, I was replaying the moment her GPS had gone still by that loft and imagining every detail she'd never admit to. I didn't know what the recorder had picked up yet, but I had a sick feeling it was going to confirm more than I was ready to hear. I waited until she went upstairs for a shower before I finally plugged the recorder into my laptop. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. For a few seconds, there was only static and muffled noises, footsteps, a car door shutting, but then voices came into focus. Hers and his. They weren't whispering, but they spoke in that casual, comfortable way people do when they're somewhere they think no one can hear them. I braced myself for the worst. Instead, what I heard shifted everything. They talked about work, real, boring, marketing work. Then they laughed about a failed campaign pitch. That same place, note. It turned out to be where Bryce had agreed to meet another coworker for a side project. My wife had apparently been helping him fix a personal problem he didn't want the whole office to know about, something about debt and a potential job offer elsewhere. And the key? It was for the loft where Bryce was temporarily staying after moving out of his apartment. It wasn't the tangled romance I had pictured in my head. It was, messy, sure, but not what I feared. I sat there for a long time, realizing how far I'd let my mind spiral and how much damage I could have caused if I'd confronted her with nothing but suspicions. When she came downstairs, hair damp and smiling, I felt this wave of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. That night, instead of plotting or pacing, I told her honestly how distant I'd been feeling and how certain things had made me uneasy. She looked me in the eyes, listened without snapping, and explained everything without hesitation. She even laughed when I admitted I thought Bryce was trying to steal her away. Leonard, she said, if I wanted Bryce, you'd have known the first day I met him. You're it for me, even when you're overthinking everything. It was embarrassing, but it also felt good, like a weight lifting. We ended the night watching that movie she'd suggested earlier, curled up on the couch like nothing had ever been wrong. I'm not going to pretend I'll stop overthinking forever, but I do know I don't want to let my fear build a story that isn't there again. And that's my story, folks. Now I want to hear from you. What moment from this story stood out the most to you, and have you ever jumped to the wrong conclusion only to find out the truth was completely different? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget, you've been watching Reddit Confessions.